Get me someone who actually belongs up here." Dr. Kevin Mills said it loud, for the whole floor to hear, pointing at the quiet woman in scrubs near the nurse's station, like she was a stain he wanted gone. "You, coffee, black, and keep your hands off my charts." The young black woman didn't flinch. She set down what she was holding, looked him dead in the eye, and said, calm as still water, "Sir, you're gonna want me close tonight." He laughed. 2 residents laughed with him. Because to Kevin Mills, she was furniture. A night shift, nobody who emptied bins and held scared kids' hands while the important people did important work. He had no idea that the man being rushed through the ER doors at that exact moment, the patient coding in room 9, the one whose heart was quitting, was his own father. And he had no idea that the woman he'd just called furniture was the only person in that building who could pull that man back from the dead, because she wasn't the help. As of 7 p.m. tonight, she was his boss. Before this doctor finds out who is really fighting to save the man in room 9, tell me in the comments where you're watching from today. Please leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and let's dive back into the story. Her name was Simone Carter, 34 years old. And to understand why she didn't flinch when a doctor called her furniture, you have to understand that Simone Carter had been invisible her whole life and had learned to make invisibility a weapon. 11 years on the floor, night shifts, the ones nobody wanted, the 7 to 7 stretch where the hospital goes quiet and strange and the monitors beep into the dark. She knew that hospital better than the men who ran it. She knew which elevator stuck. She knew which kid in the pediatric wing cried at 3 a.m. and needed a story, not a sedative. She knew the sound a heart monitor makes in the half second before it goes wrong. Knew it in her body, before the alarm ever caught up. The doctors didn't see any of that. They saw scrubs. They saw a name tag they never read. They handed her their empty cups and their orders and their attitude, and they walked past her 100 times a night without once looking at her face. Simone let them. She'd stopped needing them to see her a long time ago. Here's the kind of thing that happened on her floor, and that nobody ever wrote down. 2 weeks before this night, a post-op patient in Bay 11, a man recovering from what should have been a routine surgery, started to go wrong in a way the machines weren't catching yet. His numbers were fine. The monitor was quiet. The on-call resident had glanced at the chart and moved on. But Simone, emptying a trash can 3 feet away, heard something in the man's breathing. A change. A wrongness. The same wrongness she'd been hearing in the dark for 11 years, she told the resident. The resident, 26 and certain, waved her off. "The numbers are fine," he said without looking up. Simone didn't argue with him. Arguing was a luxury people like her couldn't afford. Instead, she planted herself at that bedside and refused to leave, and she watched, and 4 minutes later, the man's pressure fell off a cliff exactly the way she'd known it would. Internal bleeding. She had the rapid response, the blood, and the OR moving before the resident finished processing what was happening. The man lived. In the chart, it said the resident caught it. Nobody asked the woman with the trash can how she'd known. Nobody ever did. She went home at 7 a.m., slept, and came back and did it again the next night. Invisible and indispensable in the same breath. That was the shape of Simone Carter's whole career. She was the reason people lived, and she was furniture. Both at once. Every single shift. But here's what none of them knew. What Kevin Mills especially didn't know, as he smirked and waited for his coffee. 3 weeks ago, Simone Carter had been promoted. Quietly. The hospital had created a new role, lead of the night rapid response team, the person who runs every code, every crash, every life or death emergency after dark, the one whose call the doctors are supposed to follow when a patient is dying. It had happened because of one woman who'd been paying attention. Diane Ross, the chief nursing officer, had spent 2 years fighting the board for that program, and 2 years quietly watching the night floor to find the right person to run it. She kept seeing the same name in the incident reports, in the near misses that turned into saves, in the quiet, anonymous reason a patient was still alive. Carter. Carter caught it. Carter was already at the bedside. Diane had finally pulled Simone into her office, laid the roll on the table, and watched the most competent nurse in the building hesitate, because Simone Carter had been overlooked for so long that being chosen felt almost suspicious, like a setup, like something that would be taken back. "I've watched you save lives this hospital never even thanked you for," Diane had told her. "I'm done watching you do it without the authority you've earned. Take the job, Simone." She took it. Tonight was her first shift in that role, and not one doctor on that floor had been told yet. Stay with me. Because in about 90 seconds, an ambulance was going to bring Kevin Mills the worst night of his life and hand it straight to the woman he'd just sent for coffee. To understand why Simone became a nurse at all, you have to go back to a different ER 15 years before, a different night, a different family on the worst day of its life. She was 19. Her mother, Gloria, had walked into an emergency room 2 states away, holding her own arm and saying her words came out wrong. A nurse wrote down anxiety. A doctor, busy, certain, barely looking up, agreed. They put Gloria Carter in a chair in a hallway, and they let her sit there for 5 hours. It was a stroke. Everyone who works in medicine knows the phrase, time is brain. Every minute a stroke goes untreated, the brain loses something it never gets back. There's a window, a few precious hours where you can stop it, even reverse it. By the time anyone in that ER actually looked at Gloria, the window had closed. They'd spent it deciding she didn't matter. Simone never forgot a single minute of those 5 hours because she lived every one of them in that waiting room. She was 19 and she didn't have the words yet. She didn't know to scream the word stroke, but she knew her mother was wrong, knew it in her gut, and she went to the desk again and again. "My mother needs a doctor. Please. Something's wrong with her face. Please just look at her." And every time, a tired nurse told her to sit down. They'd get to her. There were people ahead of her. It was probably her blood pressure. They handed a 19-year-old girl a clipboard and a number and told her to wait. And so she waited, holding her mother's good hand, watching the bad one curl in her lap, watching the clock she didn't yet know how to read. By the time a doctor finally walked over, annoyed, already half turned towards something more important, the window was gone. Simone watched his face change when he finally looked. She watched him understand in 1 second what she'd been begging them to see for 5 hours. And she watched it be too late, which is a thing you cannot unwatch, ever. Gloria lived, but the mother who used to braid Simone's hair and sing off-key in the kitchen spent the rest of her years in a wheelchair, her right side gone still, her words slow, robbed of half of herself by a handful of hours nobody bothered to count, because the people in charge had taken one look at a black woman in a waiting room and decided who she was. Simone went home that week and did not cry. She got very quiet instead, the way she would stay quiet for the next 15 years. And somewhere in that quiet, a thing hardened in her into a shape that would never change. Nobody was ever going to wait on her watch. Nobody was ever going to beg her to look and be ignored. She was going to become the person she had needed in that hallway and could not find. And she was going to be that person for every stranger, every shift for the rest of her life, whether anyone thanked her for it or not. Simone sat in that hallway at 19 and made a promise she never said out loud. She was going to be the one who looked, the one who counted the hours, the one who refused to walk past a human being and decide they didn't matter. She couldn't afford medical school, so she became a nurse instead. And then she became the best nurse anyone in that building had ever seen. Not that they noticed. She read every chart she wasn't supposed to read. She learned the protocols cold. She could run a code in her sleep. She built herself, year by quiet year, into exactly the person who could have saved her mother. And she did it on the night shift for $15 an hour in front of doctors who handed her their trash. Her mother passed 4 years ago. The morning of the funeral, Simone took the small gold pin off her mother's old nursing home cardigan. Gloria had worn it like a medal even after she could no longer work, and she pinned it under her own collar where no one could see it. She'd worn it every single shift since, right over her heart, a reminder of exactly why she didn't flinch, and exactly why she would never, ever let some doctor's ego cost a patient their life. She just never imagined the patient would be that doctor's own father. And she had no idea, clipping her badge on at 6:58 that evening, that the cardigan pin was about to mean more in one night than it had in 4 years. Kevin Mills was, on paper, brilliant, top of his class, fast hands, faster mouth. The kind of doctor who was used to being the smartest man in any room and made sure everyone felt it. He was also the kind of man who divided the world into people who mattered and people who didn't, and he made that math in the first 2 seconds of meeting you. Nurses got instructions, never eye contact. Aides got his coffee order. The cleaning staff got nothing at all because to Kevin Mills, they had already disappeared. The whole floor flinched when his name came up on the schedule. There was a language to surviving a Mills shift, passed quietly between nurses. Don't volunteer anything, don't make eye contact, answer only what he asks, and whatever you do, don't be the one he picks today. Because he always picks someone. A new grad he'd reduce to stammering over a question with no right answer. A veteran nurse he'd contradict in front of a patient just to watch her swallow it. He'd once sent a transporter, a 60-year-old man with a bad hip, back across the entire hospital twice because he didn't like the wheelchair and laughed about it. None of it ever made it into a report. Reporting Kevin Mills was a good way to find your own competence suddenly under review, and everyone knew it, and that was exactly how he liked it. What made it work, what made it possible, was the silence of everyone above him. The administration knew. Of course they knew. But Mills was board certified, fellowship trained, and he brought in the kind of money and prestige that buys a man a very long leash. So they looked away year after year, and the looking away was its own quiet message to every aide and nurse and cleaner on that floor. He matters, and you don't. And if it comes down to you or him, we have already chosen him. Simone had worked under that message for years. She had watched it break good people. And she had decided, privately, that one day it was going to break the wrong way for Kevin Mills. She just never imagined the night would arrive on a gurney with his own father's name on the chart. That night, he was in rare form. Short-staffed floor, a chip on his shoulder, an audience of residents who laughed at his jokes because their evaluations depended on it. He'd snapped at the charge nurse. He'd belittled a first year over a dosage she'd actually gotten right. And when a young aide named Tanya, 28, 3 months on the job, terrified of him, brought him the wrong size gloves, he held them up in front of the whole station. "Is this hard for you?" he said. "Gloves. We went to school for this, and you can't hand me gloves." Tanya's face crumpled. A resident snickered. Tanya was a single mom 2 months behind on rent, and she needed this job the way you need air. And Kevin Mills was making her cry in front of everyone over latex. That's when Simone stepped in. She didn't raise her voice. She just moved between them, took the gloves, handed Mills the right pair without a word, and said quietly to Tanya, "Go restock Bay 4. I've got this." Tanya fled. You should know about Tanya because she matters more to this story than a thrown pair of gloves. Tanya Brooks was 28, with a 4-year-old at home, and a mother 3 states away. She sent money to when she could, which was never. She'd taken the aide job because it was the only door open to her, and she was good at it. Gentle with the patients, quick, the kind of person who noticed when a scared kid needed their hand held. But she was new, and she was poor, and she was exactly the kind of person men like Kevin Mills used as a punching bag because she couldn't punch back. One bad review from an attending, and she was gone, and she knew it, and he knew she knew it, and that was the whole sick math of his cruelty. Simone had been quietly carrying Tanya for 3 months, showing her the things nobody teaches you, covering for her when she fumbled, telling her, in the supply closet after a hard shift, the things Simone's own mother used to say: "This town does not get to tell you who you are, baby. Only you get to decide that." Tanya didn't know yet that she had a spine of steel under all that fear. Simone knew. Simone had been Tanya once. And Simone had made a private decision weeks ago that she was not going to stand by and watch this hospital grind another good woman into nothing the way it had ground down so many before her. She just didn't know yet that tonight would be the night the chance to make good on that decision came, or that it would come riding on the worst emergency of Kevin Mills's life. Mills turned on Simone, delighted to have a fresh target. That was the moment he sent her for coffee, the moment he said, "Get me someone who belongs," the moment, though he'd never have believed it, that he started a clock running on his own humiliation. Because Simone had spent 15 years watching men like Kevin Mills. She knew the type the way you know weather. She knew the cruelty wasn't strength. It was a man performing, terrified that if he ever stopped, someone might see he was scared underneath. She'd met 100 Kevin Millses. She'd buried her mother because of one. She picked up the mop she'd set down. She did not get his coffee. She watched him strut back toward the doctor's station, playing to his little crowd, and she thought, with no anger in it at all, only a cold, steady certainty: you have no idea what's coming through those doors. And then the doors burst open. "Incoming!" a paramedic shouted, slamming through with a gurney. 70-year-old male, collapse at home, found down by a neighbor. He's crashing. We're losing him. Room 9, now. Simone was already moving, already running. It's what she did. The lead of rapid response runs toward the thing everyone else runs from. She didn't see the old man's face yet. Neither did Kevin Mills, frozen at the station with the coffee that never came. Neither of them knew, in that first electric second, that the dying man on the gurney shared Kevin Mills's last name. Here's what makes this night land the way it does, and I need you to hold on to it. At 6:58, the hospital had quietly handed Simone Carter command of every emergency on that floor, and at 7:02, the emergency coming through the door was Kevin Mills's father. The man on the gurney was Walter Mills, 70 years old, and Walter and Kevin hadn't spoken in 9 years. It was the kind of silence that calcifies in families. An argument, a funeral they both attended and didn't speak at, a phone number neither one would dial first. Kevin told himself his father was stubborn and cold. The truth, the one Kevin couldn't look at, was that Walter had shown up to every one of Kevin's school events alone and proud, had worked double shifts to pay for the schooling that made Kevin a doctor, and had spent 9 years waiting for a call that never came. Walter lived alone now. A neighbor had found him on the kitchen floor. The break had happened at Kevin's mother's funeral 9 years back. Grief makes people cruel, and Kevin, newly minted, full of himself, ashamed in some buried way of where he'd come from, had said a thing to his father across that casket that no son should ever say. He'd told Walter that he was an embarrassment, that a man who fixed boilers for a living and wore the same suit to every funeral couldn't possibly understand the world Kevin lived in now. That maybe it was better if they just stopped pretending they had anything in common. Walter hadn't shouted. That was the part Kevin could never scrub out of his memory. His father had just gone quiet and nodded slowly and said, "Your mama would be sad to hear you talk like that, son. But I'll still be here when you're ready." And then Walter had gone home to the small house where he'd raised Kevin, and he'd kept the porch light on, and he'd waited. He called on Kevin's birthday. Every year, Kevin let it go to voicemail. Every year. Walter never left an angry message, never guilt-tripped him, just, "It's your dad. Thinking about you today. Hope you're doing good. Love you." 9 voicemails, 9 years, sitting unanswered in a phone. Kevin couldn't bring himself to delete and couldn't bring himself to call back. Pride is a slow poison, and Kevin Mills had been drinking it for 9 years, certain there'd always be time to fix it later. And now, later, was a gray-faced man on a gurney with a stopping heart. And the only person who could buy Kevin one more chance to pick up the phone was the night nurse he'd just sent for coffee. Simone hit room 9 first, gloves already on, calling it as she moved. Pulse, rhythm, pressure, the fast, clean shorthand of someone whose hands know the work without asking the brain. The monitor was a mess. The man's heart was failing in real time, his color going gray, that specific gray Simone had seen too many times. "Talk to me," she said to the paramedic, hands already on the patient, peeling back an eyelid, feeling for the carotid. "Down how long?" Neighbor heard a thump, called it in. Could have been on the floor 20 minutes before we got there. Lost his pulse in the rig 2 minutes out. We were bagging him the whole way. 20 minutes, maybe more. Every one of those minutes was a door closing, and Simone could feel them closing, the same way she'd felt the hours run out in a hallway 15 years ago. But she didn't let it touch her hands. That was the whole discipline, the thing she'd built herself out of. The part of her that was screaming stayed locked in a back room, and the part of her that worked stayed cool as the tile floor. "Get him on the monitor, full leads now. Bag him, 15 liters. I want IV access, 2 lines, large bore. Where is my doctor?" She was reading the rhythm even as she barked it, and what she saw made her jaw tighten. The heart wasn't beating, it was quivering, that useless electrical storm that empties out into death if nobody breaks it fast. Seconds mattered now, not minutes. Seconds. A nurse and a tech crashed into the room behind her. The machine was beeping wrong, and the one person who was supposed to walk in and lead this, the attending physician on duty, was still out at the station because he didn't yet know that the worst moment of his life was lying gray and dying 10 feet away with his own last name on the chart. She didn't know who he was, not yet. She knew what he was, a human being, somebody's father, about to die in front of her. And that was the only thing that had ever mattered to Simone Carter. "I need a doctor in room 9, she called. "Now!" Kevin Mills walked in, annoyed, still wearing the attitude. "What do we have?" he started, in the bored voice of a man who assumed he was about to fix something a nurse couldn't. Then he looked at the patient's face, and Dr. Kevin Mills, brilliant, untouchable, the smartest man in every room, stopped breathing. The coffee cup he was still holding hit the floor. "Dad?" The word came out of him cracked and small, a sound none of the residents had ever heard him make, a sound that belonged to a frightened little boy and not to the man who'd been mocking the staff 10 minutes ago. That's my father," he said, and his voice climbed toward panic. "That's my dad. What's wrong with him? Why is he—" Somebody, do something. But his hands weren't moving. His brilliant, certain hands hung frozen at his sides, shaking, useless. Because there is a thing that happens to even the best doctor when the body on the table is the one that raised him. The training drains out, and all that's left is a terrified son. The monitor screamed. Walter Mills's heart was stopping, and the only person in that room steady enough to save him was the woman Kevin had sent for coffee. She stepped forward, put her body between the panicking doctor and the dying man, and took command. "He's in cardiac arrest," Simone said, flat and clear and absolutely calm. "I've got the airway. Start compressions. Somebody get me the crash cart and page the code. I am running this." Nobody moved. A resident looked at Mills, confused. Who was she to give orders? Simone turned her head, and for the first time all night, there was iron in her voice. "I said I'm running this code. Move." And the room moved. It moved because there is a kind of authority that has nothing to do with a title on a badge, and every person who has ever worked a hospital floor knows it the instant they hear it. The residents jumped. A nurse hit the code button. The crash cart came screaming around the corner, and Simone Carter, $15 an hour, sent for coffee 90 seconds ago, became the calmest, most powerful person in the building. "Compressions, hard and fast. Count them out loud," she ordered, hands flying, reading the monitor, reading the man. "Push 1 milligram epi. I want pads on him now. Charging." Her voice never rose and never shook. It just landed, clean, and the team locked onto it like a lifeline in the dark, because that is exactly what it was. Kevin stood against the wall, shaking, watching a stranger fight for his father's life with a competence he could not have summoned in that moment if his own life depended on it. Is he going to? He started. Quiet, Simone said. Not cruel, just absolute. I need the room, clear. The shock hit Walter's chest. His body jumped. The line on the monitor stayed flat. Resume compressions, again in 2 minutes. She didn't blink. She'd been here before, 100 dark nights, fighting this exact fight for strangers. Nobody important was watching. The difference tonight was that the most important man in the hospital was pressed against the wall, learning for the first time in his life what it looked like when the person he'd called nothing was the only thing standing between his family and the worst phone call there is. If your heart is pounding right now, good. That's the point. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications, because what this woman does in the next 4 minutes is going to flip this whole story on its head. And you do not want to miss the moment Kevin Mills finds out who she really is. 2 minutes of war, compressions, drugs, the metronome of a count, the awful flat hum of a heart that would not restart. Simone worked it like a problem she refused to lose, adjusting, redosing, her eyes moving between the monitor and the man's gray face, hunting for the door back to life that she knew was still there if she was good enough and fast enough to find it. The resident doing compressions was tiring, his arms shaking, his rhythm slipping. Simone saw it without looking. Tanya, she called, not even raising her voice, because Tanya, who had fled to Bay 4 in tears 20 minutes ago, had crept back to the doorway of room 9, drawn by the alarm, unable to stay away. Get in here, swap in on compressions, now. For one heartbeat, Tanya froze, terrified, sure she'd do it wrong, sure she didn't belong in a room like this. Then she met Simone's eyes, and Simone gave her the smallest nod, the one that said, I've got you, you can do this. I wouldn't have called your name if you couldn't. And Tanya stepped over the dropped coffee cup and put her hands on a dying man's chest and started to push, hard and clean, exactly the way Simone had taught her in 100 quiet moments nobody had been watching. The frightened aide Kevin Mills had reduced to tears was now, literally, helping to keep his father's blood moving. Good, Simone said. Just like that. Don't stop. Then the monitor changed, and not for the better. The flat line jumped into a wild, useless tremor, the heart twitching instead of beating, the rhythm that kills you if you don't break it in seconds. A lesser team would have panicked. Simone's voice only got calmer. Vive fib, charging again, everybody clear, Tanya, hands off now. The shock cracked through Walter's body. Nothing. Resume, push another round of EPI. Come on, Mr. Mills, not tonight. You've got a phone call to answer. Nobody in the room knew what she meant by that. Simone didn't either, not really. It was just the thing that came out of her, the thing she always whispered to the ones the world had given up on. Come on, not tonight, stay. She had been on the losing end of this fight more times than she would ever tell anyone. She knew exactly how often the door back to life stays shut, no matter how good you are. And she knew that the man under Tanya's hands had maybe one more round in him before this became the other kind of night. The kind where she'd have to walk into a waiting room and tell a son something that could never be taken back. And then Kevin Mills made the worst mistake of his career, because somewhere in his panic, the wounded ego clawed its way back up, the need to be the one in control, the doctor, the smart one, and he shoved off the wall and stepped in. Move. I've got him. He's my father. I'm the physician here. He reached for the medication, his shaking hands grabbing for a syringe, reaching to push a drug that, in his panic, in his terror, was exactly the wrong call, a dose that would have stopped Walter's heart for good. Simone saw it in half a second, the same half second she'd trained 15 years to own. She caught his wrist. Hard. In front of the residents, in front of everyone, the night shift, nobody, gripped the attending physician's hand and stopped it cold an inch above his own father's IV line. "Don't," she said. "That dose will kill him. You are not thinking, doctor. You are scared, and you are about to put your father in the ground with your own hand. So you are going to step back, right now, and you are going to let me save him." The room froze. A resident's mouth fell open. Nobody, in the history of that floor, had ever seen anyone grab Kevin Mills's hand and tell him no. For one terrible second, it could have gone either way. Then Walter's monitor let out a sound, and every head snapped toward it. A beep. Then another, ragged, uneven, and then steadier. A rhythm. Faint, fragile, but real. Simone let go of Kevin's wrist and was back at the man's side before anyone else had processed it, her hands and voice moving together. "I've got a pulse. Weak, but it's there. Keep that line open, hang the drip. I want him on the monitor and warmed. We are not out of this yet, people. Stay sharp." Color was crawling back into Walter's face, that gray giving way, inch by inch, to something that looked like a living man again. She had done it. In the room where the brilliant doctor froze, the woman he'd sent for coffee had reached into the dark and pulled his father back. Kevin Mills slid down the wall until he was sitting on the floor of room 9, and he put his face in his hands, and the smartest man in every room made a sound like something breaking. Relief and shame and 9 years of silence all came out of him at once, ugly and human, while the residents looked anywhere but at him. Something had shifted in that room, and everyone in it felt it. The residents who had laughed at his jokes an hour ago, who had snickered when he sent the nurse for coffee, were looking at Kevin Mills on the floor and then at Simone over the patient, and a quiet, permanent recalibration was happening behind their eyes. They had just watched their attending, the man whose approval they chased, whose cruelty they had excused as brilliance, freeze, and nearly kill a patient. And they had watched the woman he'd treated like a servant reach into death and pull a man back out of it with her bare hands. You cannot unsee a thing like that. The pecking order they had all been living inside had just been exposed as a lie, in real time, in a trauma room at night. One of them, a second year named Priya, knelt down next to Mills, not out of warmth exactly, but because that's what you do for a person who's broken on the floor. The others stood useless, and through all of it, Simone never stopped working, titrating the drip, watching the rhythm, talking low to her patient, because the job was the job, and the man's heart didn't care who was crying and who wasn't. She had given them all a master class without saying a single word about it. She wasn't trying to. She was just trying to keep Walter Mills alive. The lesson was a side effect. It always had been. Simone didn't gloat. She didn't even look at him. She was still working, checking, adjusting, talking low and warm to an unconscious man because she'd learned long ago that some part of them hears you. "You're okay now, Mr. Mills. You're not going anywhere tonight. I've got you." The exact words nobody had said to her own mother 15 years ago, in a hallway, while a window closed. Walter was stable, not safe. There would be a long night and longer days ahead, but alive and trending the right way, which after what the room had just witnessed felt like a small resurrection. And that's when the door opened, and the truth Kevin Mills had been too arrogant to see walked in wearing a suit. Her name was Diane Ross, the hospital's chief nursing officer, in at this hour only because it was the launch night of the program she'd fought the board for 2 years to fund. She took in the room in one sweep, the stabilized patient, the shaken residents, the attending physician sitting on the floor, and Simone Carter, standing at the center of it with her hands still on her patient. "Simone," Diane said, and her voice carried clear across the silent room. "Report." And Simone gave it crisp, complete, the language of command, and Diane nodded along, and then she turned to the residents because she could feel the confusion in the room, and she intended to end it. "For anyone who doesn't know," Diane said, This is Simone Carter. As of 7 o'clock tonight, she is the lead of this hospital's night rapid response team. That means when a patient is coding after dark, hers is the voice in the room, not the attending's, hers. She runs the code, she makes the calls, and everyone follows her lead. Her eyes moved deliberately to the doctor on the floor. "Is that understood, Dr. Mills?" Kevin looked up. He looked at the woman he had pointed at and called furniture, the woman he'd sent for coffee, the woman whose wrist had stopped his hand from killing his own father 90 seconds ago, the woman who, it turned out, he was supposed to have been taking orders from the entire time. And Kevin Mills, who had never in his adult life been at a loss for words, opened his mouth and found that he had none. "I asked you a question," Diane said quietly. "Understood," he managed. It came out in a whisper. Simone finally looked at him, then really looked at him, the way no one had looked at her all night. There was no triumph in it, just something steadier and harder to face than triumph. "I told you," she said, "you'd want me close tonight." They moved Walter up to the ICU within the hour. Simone went with him, handed him off herself, gave the report herself, made sure the night team upstairs knew every detail, because that was the job. And the job didn't stop because the man's son happened to be a doctor who'd called her furniture. And then, because the floor never sleeps, she went back to work. There were other patients. There was a med to hang and a chart to fix and a frightened family in Bay 6 to sit with. Simone Carter did all of it, the same as any other night, while word of what had happened in room 9 spread through the hospital like a current under the floor. There was also a little girl in the pediatric wing, 7 years old, hooked up to more machines than a child should ever know, who couldn't sleep because the beeping scared her in the dark. Simone had maybe 90 seconds to spare and a dozen things still on her list, the way she always did. She gave the 90 seconds to the kid. She sat on the edge of the bed and told her about the ocean back home, about waves that come in at night, whether anyone's awake to see them or not, about how the tide always comes back, always, you can count on it. It never once forgot to come back. The little girl's eyes got heavy. "Do the waves come back even when it's dark?" she whispered. "Especially when it's dark," Simone said. The child fell asleep holding 2 of her fingers. This was the woman Kevin Mills had sent for coffee, not just the one with the steady hands and a code. This one too, the one who gave away 90 seconds she didn't have to a kid. Nobody important was watching. At the same hour, the most powerful man in the hospital was learning her name for the first time 3 floors up. The 2 things were the same thing. They always had been. And she wasn't the only one. That was the part the Kevin Millses of the world never understood. The night hospital ran on a whole invisible army of them. There was Ramon, the housekeeper, 61 years old, who knew every long-term patient by name and slipped extra blankets to the ones whose families never came. There was Dee, the transporter, who hummed gospel under her breath, pushing gurneys down empty halls at 4 a.m., so the scared ones wouldn't feel so alone. There was the kitchen worker who always sent up an extra pudding cup for the diabetic kid in 612, who wasn't supposed to have it, but needed something sweet on a hard night. None of them mattered, according to the people who ran the place. All of them were the reason the place worked at all. They knew each other, that army. They covered for each other, fed each other on bad nights, held each other up. And they all knew Simone Carter, knew she was one of them, the best of them. The one who'd never once acted like the scrubs made her better than the mop. So, when the word went around the next morning about what had happened in room 9, about the night shift nurse who'd saved the big doctor's father and turned out to outrank him, the invisible army of that hospital felt something they hadn't felt in a long time. They felt seen, by proxy maybe, but seen. Kevin Mills did not go back to work. Kevin Mills sat in the ICU waiting room with his head in his hands, a doctor who suddenly couldn't remember how to be one, staring at a vending machine and seeing his father's gray face. Around 2 a.m., Simone found him there. She wasn't looking for him. She was on her way to check a patient. But he stood up when he saw her, fast, like a man who'd been waiting. "How is he?" Kevin asked. "Really, don't give me the soft version. I'm a doctor." "You're his son," Simone said. "Tonight you're his son. He's holding. The next few days will tell us more. But he's alive, and an hour ago that was not a sure thing." Kevin nodded, his mouth worked, and then the question came out of him, the one that had been eating him alive in that plastic chair. "Why did you save him?" Simone tilted her head. "I treated you like garbage," Kevin said, and his voice cracked on it. For years, not just you, everyone like you. I've done it your whole career. And tonight you had my father's life in your hands, and you had every reason in the world to be a half-second slow, to let my own mistake go through, and nobody would ever have known. Why did you save him? It was the most honest thing he had ever said to another human being in that building, and he hated how much he needed the answer. Simone was quiet for a moment. Then she reached up to her collar, and for the first time in 4 years, she showed someone the small gold pin underneath. "This was my mother's," she said. "If you've ever loved someone, the system looked right through. Stay with me, because what she says next is the heart of this whole thing. Drop a comment, hit subscribe, and let's finish it together." 15 years ago, Simone said, my mother walked into an ER saying her words came out wrong and her arm wouldn't work. And a doctor who was busy and certain and couldn't be bothered to really look at a black woman in a waiting room wrote down anxiety and put her in a hallway chair. For 5 hours. She held the pin between 2 fingers. It was a stroke, Dr. Mills. 5 hours. By the time anyone looked at her, the part of her that braided my hair and sang in the kitchen was gone. She spent the rest of her life in a chair because someone decided in 2 seconds that she didn't matter. Kevin couldn't speak. "So no," Simone said, "it never once crossed my mind to be slow. Because I don't save people because of who their son is, or whether they were kind to me, or whether they're important. I save them because somebody should have saved her. Every patient I touch is my mother in that hallway, including yours." She tucked the pin back under her collar. "That's the difference between us. You decide who matters. I decided a long time ago that everybody does." She walked away to go check on a stranger in Bay 6 and left Kevin Mills standing in a waiting room at 2 a.m., understanding for the first time in his life exactly what he had been all these years and exactly what he had nearly thrown away. Walter Mills woke up the next afternoon. The first thing he saw was his son asleep in the chair beside the bed. The son who hadn't spoken to him in 9 years, who hadn't returned a single call, slumped and exhausted and unshaven, holding his hand. Walter looked at him for a long time before Kevin stirred. "You're here?" Walter rasped. It wasn't a question. It was a kind of wonder. Kevin came apart. 9 years of stubborn silence, of pride, of telling himself his father was cold. It all collapsed at once next to a hospital bed. "I'm sorry, Dad," he said. "I'm so sorry. You almost died, and the last 9 years He couldn't finish. "I know," Walter said softly, squeezing his son's hand with what little strength he had. "I know, son. I never stopped showing up to an empty phone. But you're here now." It wasn't a clean recovery. Walter's heart had been starved of oxygen for too long on that kitchen floor, and the next 72 hours were touch and go. A second scare on the second night. A stretch where the numbers slid the wrong way, and Kevin, who had spent his whole career delivering bad odds to other families, had to sit on the receiving end of them and learn what that felt like. He didn't leave. He slept in the chair, unshaven, in the same clothes, holding his father's hand through the bad hours the way Walter had once sat up with him through childhood fevers. The nurses brought Kevin coffee now, and he said thank you, and meant it, and learned their names while he waited, because terror has a way of teaching a man what his arrogance never could. Simone checked on Walter every shift, even when he wasn't her patient anymore, even when she had 100 other things to do. She'd slip in at 4 a.m. when Kevin was finally asleep in the chair, and she'd read the monitors and adjust a line and stand for a moment over the man whose life she'd refused to let go. She never made it about herself. But once, on the third night, Walter was awake when she came in, and he watched her work in the dim light, and he said, in a rasp, "You're the one, aren't you? The one from that first night." Simone just smiled and told him to rest. Walter held on to that, though. He'd remember it. And standing in the doorway with a chart she didn't really need to deliver in person, Simone Carter watched a father and son find each other again across 9 wasted years. A reunion that only existed because a woman somebody called Furniture had refused to be a half-second slow. She didn't go in. Some moments aren't yours to stand in. She set the chart in the door rack and went back to her floor. And here is where the story almost went the way these stories usually go. Because the hospital's first instinct, the next morning, was not gratitude. It was self-protection. Kevin Mills was a brilliant attending who brought in money and prestige. Simone Carter was a night shift nurse who, on paper, had grabbed a physician's hand, overridden his orders, and created a chaotic clinical environment. Guess which one the machine moved to protect first? They called Simone into an office before her shift, 3 suits and a stack of paper. And the questions weren't, how did you save that man? The questions were, did you physically restrain Dr. Mills? Did you countermand an attending physician? Are you aware that as a nurse you operated outside your scope? The word they kept circling back to was insubordination. There was talk, careful, lawyerly talk, of suspending her pending review, of quietly walking back the brand new title she'd held for exactly 1 shift. For a moment, it was the hallway all over again, the system taking one look and deciding who mattered and who didn't. The important man shielded, the invisible woman blamed. The exact machine that had cost Gloria Carter half her life, grinding forward to do it again to her daughter. Simone sat very still through all of it. She didn't beg and she didn't rage. When they finished, she said only one thing. Pull the record, the monitor data, the times, the residents' accounts, the dose he reached for. Pull all of it. I'll stand on every second of what I did in that room. Will he? Then she went and clocked in because she had patience, and because women like Simone don't get to stop working while the powerful decide their fate. And the record, when they pulled it, did not say what they wanted it to say. The timeline was brutal and clear. An attending physician froze, then reached for a dose that would have killed the patient. And a nurse stopped him and ran a textbook-perfect code that brought a man back from a systole. 3 residents, finally telling the truth, said the same thing in 3 separate rooms. The thing meant to bury Simone had her fingerprints all over a life she'd saved, and his fingerprints an inch from a life he'd nearly taken. The inquiry they had opened to discipline the nurse quietly turned into the one that finally examined the doctor. Because 3 residents had watched Kevin Mills nearly push a fatal dose into his own father's line, and watched a nurse stop his hand, and people talk. And the charge nurse had already filed a report, not about the code, which Simone had run flawlessly, but about the weeks and months and years before it. The cruelty, the humiliations, the aide named Tanya he'd reduced to tears over a pair of gloves. The pattern of a man who treated half the staff like they weren't human. For the first time, with the night's events as a spotlight, all of it was on the table at once. And the same administration that had spent years looking the other way because Kevin Mills was brilliant and brought in money suddenly had a problem it could not unsee. The inquiry happened 2 days later in a conference room with 2 bright lights, and at first it went exactly the way these things always go. A hospital vice president named Glassman opened by talking about an isolated incident under extraordinary personal stress, about Dr. Mills's exemplary record, and the value he brings to this institution. You could feel the room being steered gently toward the conclusion where nothing changed and everyone kept their jobs, and the founder of the problem stayed exactly where he was. Then the residents talked. Maybe it was Simone's example in room 9. Maybe it was just that the spell had broken. But one by one, the young doctors who'd spent years laughing at Mills's jokes because their evaluations depended on it told the truth instead. About the dosage he'd nearly pushed, about the pattern, about the way the whole floor flinched when he walked in. Glassman's steering started to slip, and then Tanya stood up. Nobody had asked her to. She was an aide. She wasn't even supposed to be in that room. But she stood up in her scrubs in front of the vice presidents with her hands shaking, and she said, "He made me cry over a pair of gloves, in front of everybody. And that wasn't the first time, and I'm not the only one, and most of us never say anything because we can't afford to lose the job." Her voice broke, and then it steadied, because somewhere in the last 2 days, a frightened young woman had found the spine Simone always knew was there. You all knew, everybody knew, and you let it go because he was important, and we weren't. So I'd like that in the record too, from someone who isn't important. The room was very quiet after that. Glassman had no script for a person who wasn't supposed to matter, refusing to stay quiet. And that was before they even got to Simone. They came to Simone. Of course they did. As the new rapid response led, as the person at the center of the night, they wanted her statement. They practically handed her the knife. One word from her about the wrist grab, about the near-fatal error, about years of abuse, and Kevin Mills's career was finished. And Simone Carter had every reason in the world to use it. She didn't. Not because she was a saint, and not because Kevin Mills deserved mercy. He didn't, and she knew it. She refused to use the knife because she had learned something a long time ago, in a hallway, holding her mother's hand, that the goal was never to destroy the people who looked through you. The goal was to make sure they could never look through anyone again. So, when the administrators leaned in, pens ready, practically begging her to bury him, Simone gave them something they did not expect. "I'm not going to lie about what happened in that room," she said. "He panicked, he overrode me, and he reached for a dose that would have killed his father. I stopped it. That goes in the record exactly as it happened, because the next patient deserves a system that tells the truth." The administrators nodded, satisfied, reaching for the story they wanted. "But," Simone went on, "if you're sitting here ready to end one doctor's career over one night, and you spend not 1 minute on the thing that actually almost killed people in this hospital, then you've learned nothing, and I've got no use for this meeting." They blinked. "For years," she said, "every nurse and aide and tech on the night shift has watched that man, and men like him treat us like furniture. And every year you look the other way because he was brilliant and he made you money. You let him scream a single mother named Tanya into tears over a pair of gloves last night. A woman who is twice the human being he is, and 1/10 the price, and who you'd fire without blinking. The danger in this hospital was never one bad night. It was a building that decided some people matter and some people don't. I lost my mother to exactly that. So here's my statement." She laid it out, and it was not a demand for revenge. It was a blueprint that the Night Rapid Response Program, the one they had buried in a quiet launch, be made real, funded, and given the authority it was promised, so the person most able to save a life in the room is the person who runs it, title or no title. That every frontline worker, every aide and tech and housekeeper be paid like a human being and named out loud when they save a life, because they do it every single night and nobody ever knows. That Tanya keep her job, get the training she'd been begging for, and never again be made small by anyone wearing a longer coat. And that Kevin Mills not be quietly fired to make the problem disappear, but be made to answer for it in the open, and be made to learn in front of the very people he'd spent years stepping over. "Firing him lets all of you off the hook," she said. "I'm not interested in letting you off the hook. I'm interested in changing the floor." For a moment, it looked like the room might still slide back to its old shape. Glassman, the vice president, cleared his throat, and started in with the language these rooms always reach for: the budget realities, the staffing market, Dr. Mills's value to the institution. These are admirable goals, Ms. Carter, but we have to be realistic about what's actually feasible. The soft, reasonable voice of every system that has ever decided the people at the bottom should keep waiting their turn. Diane Ross cut him off. "What's not feasible, Richard," she said, "is explaining to a reporter why a hospital nearly disciplined the nurse who saved a coding patient while protecting the doctor who froze, or why a man who humiliated staff for years did it with this administration's full knowledge. We have the record. We have the residents on the record. We have the dose he reached for, time-stamped." She let that sit. "So we can spend the budget on Ms. Carter's plan now, on our terms, or we can spend 10 times as much later on everyone else's. Your call. But I think you already know it's not really a call." The room was silent. The chief nursing officer, Diane Ross, was almost smiling. They did it Simone's way. All of it. Kevin Mills was not quietly fired with a severance and a non-disclosure, the way brilliant men usually get to disappear from their mistakes. He was placed on formal probation, stripped of his supervisory role over nursing staff, required to complete a remediation program, and, the part that cut deepest, all made to answer for it in the open, not behind a closed door, in front of the floor. There's a kind of justice that happens in a conference room with a settlement, and there's the kind that happens when a proud man has to stand in front of the people he spent years stepping on and account for himself out loud. Simone had insisted on the second kind, not to humiliate him. She'd had every chance to humiliate him and passed it up. But because the staff he'd ground down deserved to watch him answer, and because a man only really changes when the changing costs him something in public. So Kevin Mills stood in front of the night shift, the nurses, the aides, the techs, the people he'd called nothing, and he listened while the findings were read. The frozen hands, the dose, the pattern, the years. He did not defend himself. When it was done, he was asked if he had anything to say, and the man who'd always had a cutting answer for everything looked out at a room full of people he had never once bothered to see, and he said, "You all kept this place running, while I treated you like you were furniture. My father is alive because one of you is better at my job, on her worst paid night, than I am on my best. I don't have a defense, I just have an apology, and I know it's not worth much yet. I'm going to spend a long time trying to make it worth something." It wasn't a movie speech. His voice shook, and he didn't make eye contact at first, but it was real, and the room could tell it was real, and that was the beginning of the only redemption that ever actually counts. The slow, unglamorous, earned kind. Kevin Mills changed, not overnight, and not into a saint. People like Kevin rarely become saints. But the man who walked back onto that floor 2 weeks later was not the man who'd left it. The first thing he did, in front of the whole station, was find Tanya. He did not perform it. There was no audience to play to anymore. And that was the point. "I humiliated you over a pair of gloves," he said, "in front of everyone. I've done it to a lot of people, but I did it to you, and I'm sorry. It was never about the gloves. It was about me." Tanya didn't quite know what to say. Nobody did. The smartest man in every room had finally said the smartest thing of his life, which was, "I was wrong." He started learning names. He started looking at faces. It was small and awkward at first, a man relearning how to be a person. But it held, because every time his old self started to surface, he would think of his father's gray face and a nurse's hand catching his wrist an inch above the line. And he would remember exactly what his arrogance had nearly cost him. There was a moment, a few months on, that told you the change was real and not a performance. An elderly woman came into the ER, confused, alone, in a worn coat, exactly the kind of patient the old Kevin would have triaged in 2 seconds as not worth his time. A resident, doing the math the way Kevin had taught a generation of them to do it, started to wave her down the priority list. And Kevin stopped him. "Slow down," he said. "Look at her. Actually look." He pulled up a chair, sat at the old woman's eye level, Kevin Mills, who used to hand nurses his trash without a glance. And he took the time, and he found the small bleed in her brain that the fast version of himself would have sent home to die. She walked out of that hospital a week later on her own 2 feet. Nobody made a speech about it, but Simone heard, the way she heard everything on that floor, and somewhere under her collar, her mother's pin felt a little less heavy than it used to. Walter Mills recovered, slowly, then steadily. And the son who had ignored him for 9 years drove him to every follow-up, sat in every waiting room, made up for as much lost time as a man can. They had Sunday dinners again. Walter told anyone who'd listen that a night nurse had given him back his son along with his life, and he wasn't wrong. The first night Walter was strong enough to sit up and talk, Kevin did something he should have done 9 years before. He took out his phone, and with his father watching, he played the voicemails. All 9 of them. 9 birthdays. "It's your dad. Thinking about you today. Hope you're doing good. Love you." He'd never been able to delete them, and never been able to answer them. And now he sat in a hospital room and let his father hear that he'd kept every single one. 2 grown men cried over a cheap phone speaker, and 9 years of silence finally ended. A few weeks later, when Walter was home, Kevin did one more thing that the old Kevin would never have done. He invited Simone to Sunday dinner. She almost said no. It wasn't her place, she said. She was just the nurse. But Walter had insisted, had practically ordered it from his recovery chair, because he wanted to look in the eyes of the woman who'd refused to be a half-second slow and tell her thank you in his own kitchen. So Simone came, and Walter held her hand in both of his, the way the grateful do, and he said, "My son tells me you do this every night, for strangers, for people nobody's watching." Simone said yes, and Walter said, "Then I'm not the only life you've saved. I'm just the one who got to say thank you." Simone had to look at the floor for a moment after that. It was, she realized, the first time in 11 years that anyone had. And it wasn't just words on a banner. 3 months in, the Night Rapid Response Team, funded, staffed, and actually given authority now, caught a teenager sliding into septic shock on a quiet Tuesday, hours before the old system would have noticed. And the kid went home to his mother instead of to a morgue. That happened because a nurse's call now carried weight after dark. It happened because of what Simone had refused to let them sweep away. Nobody outside that floor will ever know that boy's name, or hers. He's alive anyway. And Tanya, the aide Kevin Mills had broken over a pair of gloves, became the quiet center of it. She kept her job, then outgrew it. With the hospital paying her tuition and Simone signing every reference, Tanya Brooks started nursing school. Her 4-year-old drew her a picture of Mama in her nurse coat that Tanya taped inside her locker, right where she'd see it on the hard nights. She had found the spine Simone always swore was there. The woman they'd decided didn't matter, was on her way to being the next one running into the rooms everyone else ran from. A year later, the hospital held its first recognition night for frontline staff. Simone had insisted it be nurses and aides and techs, honored by the patients and families they had cared for, not administrators patting themselves on the back. Tanya was there in a new badge. She'd started nursing school, with the hospital paying. The Night Rapid Response Program had become a model other hospitals were calling about. And the people who emptied the bins and mopped the floors and held the dying hands at 3 a.m. got, for one night, to stand up and be seen. The families came, that night, the ones who'd asked, on their worst days, who that nurse was, who that aide was, the one who sat with my mother, the one who held my son's hand. They came to say it out loud, finally, to faces and names. A mother whose premature baby had made it stood up and thanked the night tech who had noticed the baby's color change before the monitor did. An old man thanked the housekeeper who used to sit with him when he had no visitors. One by one, the invisible were made visible, and more than one of them cried because nobody had ever done this for them before. In the front row, in a wheelchair, sat Walter Mills, recovered now, thinner but bright-eyed, with his son standing beside him, one hand on the chair. Kevin Mills, in the audience instead of on a stage for once, had asked to come. He'd wanted to see it. Tanya had already been called up by then, in her brand-new nursing student whites, and she'd held her little certificate like it was made of gold, and her 4-year-old had clapped from Walter's lap, and Simone had watched from the back with her arms folded and something warm and aching in her chest. Simone Carter stood at the back, the way she always did. Diane Ross called her name to the stage, and the room rose, doctors included. Kevin Mills on his feet clapping hardest of all, Walter reaching up from his wheelchair to grip his son's hand. Simone walked up, and she didn't make a speech about herself. She reached up to her collar, unpinned the small gold pin she'd worn over her heart for 4 years, and held it up so the room could see it. "This was my mother's," she said. The system looked right through her once, and it cost her everything. So, whatever we build here, let's build it so that never happens to anyone's mother again. Look at the person next to you, the one nobody important notices. That's where the saving actually happens. So, let me ask you something before you go. There is a person you walk past, maybe today, maybe every day. The one in the scrubs, or the uniform, or the apron. The one whose name tag you've never read, whose face you couldn't describe, who you've decided, without ever deciding it, simply doesn't matter very much. We all do it. We sort the people around us into the ones who count and the ones who are furniture, and we do it in 2 seconds. Off a glance. The exact same way a doctor once sorted a woman in a hallway and cost her half her life. But you have no idea who is standing quietly at the edge of your room. You have no idea what they've survived, or what they're capable of, or that the calm, invisible person you just looked through might be the only one with steady enough hands to save the thing you love most, on the worst night of your life. The most important person in the room is so rarely the loudest one. It's usually the one holding the hand in the dark that nobody thought to thank. So, here's what I want from you tonight. The next time you're about to look through someone, stop. Read the name tag. Learn the name. Treat the person everyone overlooks like they might be the most important one in the building, because one day they will be, and because it was never really about whether they had power. It was about whether you were the kind of person who saw them before you needed them too. If Simone's story moved you, tell me in the comments. Who is someone in your life who quietly holds everything together and never gets thanked? Tag them. Say their name. Hit that like button so more people find this story, subscribe, and turn on the bell so you never miss the next one. Because the title, the coat, the salary, none of it was ever the point. The point was, who runs toward you in the dark when your heart stops? And here's the last thing, the thing I really want you to sit with tonight. Simone Carter didn't save Walter Mills because she found out he was somebody's father, or because his son was a doctor, or because anyone was watching. She saved him for the same reason she sat with a frightened 7-year-old and told her the tide always comes back. Because to Simone, there was no such thing as a person who didn't matter. She'd buried the cost of the opposite belief. She knew exactly what it does to a family when someone decides in 2 seconds that a life isn't worth looking at. So she decided the other thing. Every shift for 15 years with nobody clapping. Everybody matters. Everybody. Even the man whose son called her furniture. Imagine if more of us lived like that. Imagine if you did. So tell me, and I mean really think about it. Who is the Simone in your life? The one who shows up, who holds it together, who saves you in 100 small ways you've never once thanked them for. Don't let tonight end without saying their name. Say it in the comments. Better yet, say it to them. Take care of each other. Look at the people who hold you up. And I'll see you in the next